The United States has opened up for Europeans, which obviously I saw as an opportunity that I had to take. Some of you might remember that I used to compete mainly in the US for several years, but COVID cut my connections to the US for the last couple of years. I wanted to document some of my journey this time to some of the most unique disc golf courses in the world, and also play the Las Vegas Challenge, the Disc Golf Pro Tour season opener. I started off the season good by playing myself into the lead card after the first round, but couldn't hold up and fell to 26th place. I'm actually okay with it since I haven't had this type of competition in years. Prior to the tournament, I visited two special places, the first one being the first ever disc golf course in the world, the Oak Grove in Pasadena, California. I also drove to San Diego and visited the most played pay-to-play disc golf course in the world, the Morleyfield Disc Golf Course. I used to live in San Diego part-time during 2016 to 2018, so these courses I'm pretty familiar with, which confirmed me that I need to let people know about these places and what makes them so special. So on February 14th, I got into my car, drove to Helsinki, and flew straight to Los Angeles to the home of Frisbee. Alrighty folks, it's your boy Seppo here, exploring disc golf in the United States. And obviously when we start exploring anything disc golf related, we have to come to the first disc golf course in the world where we are at right now, and that is Oak Grove Disc Golf Course in Pasadena, California, right by Los Angeles. It's a legendary place, obviously. It's the first disc golf course in the world, and I have heard different stories how it started. When they put the baskets in, did they even have the baskets in at first? I know that they played to the poles first. Since I didn't know a whole lot, off you go. John KIRKLAND, ladies and gentlemen.
Very unusual individual, 34 years old, been a Frisbee competitor for the last 10-15 years, been in every world championship. He uses the turnaround technique, which is basically the state of the art now. You seem to get more snap, and that is doing a great job. That thing won't come down.
I don't know if you saw it, but it really dipped in the wind and really got a good extra 10 to 15 yards.
John Frizzwiz KIRKLAND. I started playing in 1957, the summer of '57. Frisbees had just come out, except they weren't called Frisbees yet. They were Pluto platters. They didn't start calling them Frisbees until 1958. So I've been playing with Whammos since before they were Frisbees. I saw a green Pluto platter in the gorgeous North Carolina summer sky, and I've remembered to this moment. You know, you have those epiphanies, those times in your life where you lock in and you remember the exact circumstances. That was one of those.
Here is County of Los Angeles Department of Parks and Recreation Frisbee golf course, world's first Frisbee golf course. Some rules about Frisbee golf, and at the end, of course, happy Frisbeeing. Alright, let's do that. Starting off from hole number 1, I mean, it's a very interesting, super low ceiling hole where you gotta play the skip shot to the basket. Very tough, it's probably about 300 feet. Hole 2, I mean, usually players like to tend to throw sidearm, little skip shot to the basket. And overall, a lot of really low ceiling shots with the oaks, like leaning down, you have to go underneath the branches. A lot of basket locations underneath those spots. And definitely also a few changes that I hadn't seen before were new to me, at least, some of these. But some locals said that they have been here already for a couple of years, which totally makes sense. Here's the, oh my god, these actually got very close. First, second.
Oak Grove was the first disc golf course that was a real disc golf course. I mean, we had been playing makeshift golf courses. You know, first we've got to get to that trash can, then we got to go around, you know, everybody, there are all these pods that exist around the country and the world of people who are making up little golf courses. But Oak Grove had standardized tees and standardized targets. There were these poles that were about 5 feet tall, and you had to hit them. And we really liked it, the fact that it was standardizing, but there was a little bit of ambiguity. You know, the guy throws and it slides, and the guy says, "Yay!" and everybody else says, "I didn't hear anything." So Ed Hedgwick knew that there should be something that was unambiguous. And that was in 1975, we had the World Championships, and we had golf for the first time at Oak Grove. Following that and the feedback from the players, in the spring of '76, he started working on something that was unambiguous, and he came up with this. I was in his garage in La Cañada, and I was saying, "This is not necessarily the best target." And he says, "But it's eminently patentable, my boy." And I said, "Yes, Ed, you are a money-making fool."
Oh my God. We are at the, does it say? No, but this is one of the original baskets when this course was first installed in the ground. I don't even want to putt on it, just because I'm scared of it breaking or something. These chains are pretty thin, but interesting. I mean, it's a little bit smaller than the baskets these days. Looks like a 70% like width compared to the new one, and some flowers. They had the wintertime open this weekend, so maybe they wanted to make it pretty.
The first time that the baskets were used at the World Championships in 1976, the World Frisbee Golf Championships, and they had Oak Grove with baskets, and for the first time ever, the new disc golf course, La Mirada. And there were baskets in both those two, and I was fortunate enough to win that first one. And I remember it just like it was, you know, 50 years ago.
As I said, I got here for my first time back in 2017 to play the Wintertime Open. Wintertime Open is the big tournament here. I think it's the biggest tournament of the year, and it has been for some players the start of the season, or maybe it could be called a pre-season tournament. Paul Macbeth is pretty much local to here. He is originally from Huntington Beach, California. So that's one big reason why it has been such a big tournament, because Paul won this tournament probably almost 10 consecutive years. So I am on hole 10 right now, and this is probably the most iconic hole on the Oak Grove tournament layout, because before I got here for my first time in 2017, the year before, I had watched the Wintertime Open when Paul Macbeth won, and he eagled this hole the first 2 rounds and almost eagled it the 3rd round. So you play from that way. You got this Mando pole or post right here. You gotta go around it, and I find myself here, which is actually exactly the same spot as where Paul threw all of his drives pretty much. And the basket used to be closer than where it's now. It's like behind the tree, basically, in the hill. It used to be like in front of this tree. So I would have been putting, but it's an upshot for me now. That was nice, a played hole for me, even though I said myself. So I decided that I'm gonna go end that streak and come and take this tournament for myself. 2017 happened and I did not take it. I got 2nd though, lost to Paul by multiple strokes. However, it was a good tournament for me. Then I came back here for like fun, once or twice probably, and played a tournament here again in 2020 with a couple of my Finnish friends, and that's the last time I have been in the USA at all. and I'm very happy to be back. And this course is interesting. It's terrain here is like strange because this is in valley, like grove of these mountains are like dumping down to this area. If you go even more down there, it's like swamp land that is dry right now actually, but it's not very usable for many things, but this makes a good disc golf course, especially here in Southern California where they don't have too many wooded courses. This course definitely serves as a pretty wooded course. Another interesting thing about Oak Grove is that it's right next to the Rose Bowl Stadium. And my dad has been playing Frisbee since '79, and he got his inspiration to start playing Frisbee at first when they had a broadcast on Finnish television about the Rose Bowl Frisbee World Championships. And I just have it here on Google Maps. The Rose Bowl from Oak Grove is only 7 minutes away, 2.8 miles, which plays a huge part in why the Oak Grove disc golf course is there in the first place.
Queen's Brothers will now throw the first Frisbee.
There's Monica Liu in the women's distance. She's taken that event, I think this will be the third time. Great throw.
The Rose Bowl as a tournament was first started in 1974. Frisbee was a big enough deal to have a world championship. Whammo should put it on. And so we came up with a list of all the people. At that time, I was going around the country. I had discovered, wow, there are Frisbee pods in New York and outside Chicago and Laguna Beach and Piscataway, New Jersey, where Historic was. And so I went to all these pods, and so we came up with a list of all the people who should play in that Rose Bowl. And they flew everybody out and put them up at Caltech.
It's the World's Invitational Frisbee Championships. I'm Ed Hedrick, Steady Ed to the Frisbee players, 001, and founder of the International Frisbee Association, 70,000 members strong. On this plane are over 100 of the world's finest Frisbee throwers. Whammo, Pepsi, American Airlines have brought these players in from all over the United States and Canada, and we're ready for them in California. As you can see, they do some pretty special things with the Frisbee, and each has a specialty that brought them here to the World Championship. There's a lot of talent here, and they're anxious to get going. The goal for every competitor is to win the World Championship of Frisbee.
I'm Dan Roddick, and I'm going to talk to you today about distance, which is the most impressive of the power events in Frisbee. We have with us today Mr. John KIRKLAND, who is the current record holder in the Guinness Book of Records for the long distance throw at 112 yards. John is going to demonstrate one of the most powerful throws in Frisbee. He uses a backhand with a Berkeley power grip. A fantastic effort. This throw is currently the world's longest Frisbee field goal, flying perfectly through the uprights from over 100 yards away.
And we wanted to have golf, but he wouldn't have golf that first year. So there were only 2 championships that you could win, what they call the World Championship, which was a skills championship, which Victor Malafronte won, and distance, which I won. And that was very fortunate because Victor and I had just been signed by the Harlem Globetrotters to go on a 200 cities and 180-day tour around the United States playing Frisbee. And that was, after that Rose Bowl happened, then there was the Globetrotter Tour. Frisbee had arrived on the world as a sport. Then in '75, he put in the poles. Now golf is part of the deal. Of all the disciplines, disc golf and DDC and accuracy and distance and throw, run, and catch and MT and all the disciplines, the only one that really survived all of that overall stuff is disc golf. And it's going gangbusters. Just absolute, I couldn't be happier.
We obviously would not be here if it wasn't for people like John and Dan Roddick, Ed Hedrick, multiple people that I don't even know, none of us really know, but those are the people that started the sport, and it has since then grown into where we are at right now. And I'm, for example, able to work within the sport with a bunch of people that I get to employ and also enjoy the crowds, all the media. And actually a funny thing is that I've had this poster in my two old offices. We moved to this office a week ago, and this is my second day at the office after coming back from the United States, and now it is here. Helsinki Open, that has a picture of John Kirkland in it, and I've had the pleasure of knowing John for years and have him as my friend. He has invited me to his house and see his largest frisbee collection in the world, and him and multiple other frisbee fanatics I look up to, and I appreciate them a lot. And once again, we would not be here without all these people. Now I just hope that you enjoyed the video, and as I said earlier, I also went to Morleyfield Disc Golf Course where I documented my experience there. So that video is coming to the same channel next week on Thursday. So tune in, subscribe to Prodigy Disc YouTube channel so you won't miss it. So thank you, and I'll see you later.